The rain fell in Seoul that autumn like a whispered secret, each droplet carrying the weight of something unsaid, something buried beneath years of carefully constructed silence. Minna Park had not spoken a word in 2 years and 3 months. Not since the night her mother died. Not since that morning when her father came home with blood on his expensive Italian cuffs and a coldness in his eyes that made even the house staff flinch away like frightened birds. She was 9 years old, small for her age, with dark eyes that seemed to hold entire universes of words that would never be spoken aloud. Her therapist, Dr. Lee, said this was a form of elective mutism, a psychological response to trauma so profound that the brain simply shut down the mechanism of speech entirely. Her second therapist, Dr. Lisa Chin, suggested it was selective mutism, that the child could speak but chose not to, that somewhere in her 9-year-old mind, she had decided that silence was safer than sound, that words could be weapons and she was protecting herself from becoming either the wielder or the victim. Her father, Sang-woo Park, did not believe in therapy. He believed in control, in order, in the immaculate organization of his criminal empire that stretched across 3 continents and touched the lives of thousands without them ever knowing they had been touched. He was 48 years old and looked like he had been carved from ice. Sharp cheekbones, pale skin, hair so black it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. He moved through the world with the certainty of a man who had never been told no, who had never questioned whether his desires aligned with morality or law. His organization, the Namsan Society, had been built by his father and his father's father, passed down like a dark inheritance through the bloodline of men who understood that power was not given, it was taken, cultivated, protected with whatever violence was necessary. Minna was his only child, his heir, though she was a daughter and Korea's criminal underworld did not traditionally value daughters. He had called her his princess once, before the silence, back when she was 6 and would run through the halls of their Hanamdong mansion screaming with laughter, back when she still believed that fathers were protectors and that the world was a place where good things happened to good people. Her mother, Jiwoo, had been his wife for 12 years, a marriage of strategic alliance between 2 powerful families. But somewhere in those 12 years something had shifted. Jiwoo had stopped being a symbol and had become a person with desires of her own, with a lover she met in coffee shops in Gangnam, with plans to leave that Sang-woo discovered through his network of informants and fixers and men who specialized in the kind of surveillance that the government would call illegal. The night she died she was trying to escape. Minna had heard the argument, had pressed her small ear against the locked door of her room and heard her mother's voice rising, pleading, and then her father's voice, calm and terrible and final. And then nothing. Just the sound of her father's footsteps moving away down the hallway, and the absolute silence of the house settling around her like a burial shroud. They said Jiwoo had taken her own life, that she had jumped from the balcony of a hotel in Myeongdong while intoxicated. The official report was filed. The family mourned privately. Life continued as it always does, with the machinery of wealth and power grinding forward, indifferent to the death of one woman, even if that woman had been someone's mother. Minna had stopped speaking the morning of the funeral, during the ritual bowing, during the moment when she was supposed to pour water over her mother's ashes. She had opened her mouth and no sound had come out, and in that silence she had discovered something strange, that not speaking was actually a form of speaking, that her silence was louder and more powerful than any words she could have chosen. It had drawn attention. It had made her father uncomfortable in a way that very little made Sang-woo Park uncomfortable. It had made the therapists anxious. It had made the house staff whisper and worry. And so she had continued not speaking, had wrapped herself in silence like armor, had learned to communicate through glances and gestures and the subtle movements of her small face. 2 years of this silence had changed her. At 9 years old she had developed a peculiar kind of wisdom, the kind that comes from watching the world without the filter of language, from observing the intricate dance of human interaction with the intensity of someone watching a foreign film with subtitles. She noticed things other children did not notice. She could read her father's moods from the way he breathed, from the angle of his jaw, from the barely perceptible tension in his shoulders. She had learned to navigate the mansion's social hierarchy through observation alone, had discovered which staff members could be trusted, which ones reported everything back to her father, which ones had their own secrets that made them sympathetic to the secrets of others. Her father had tried everything. He had hired the best therapists in Seoul, then in Tokyo, then in New York. He had brought in a child psychologist from Switzerland who specialized in trauma-induced mutism. He had attempted bribery in subtle ways, New dolls. A puppy that Minna had ignored with polite indifference. A trip to Disneyland in Tokyo where she had walked through the park with her hand in her father's, silent amid the screams of joy from thousands of other children. None of it had worked. The silence remained, immutable and complete. A fortress he could not breach with money or power or the force of his considerable will. By the time Minna was 9 years and 2 months old, her father had resigned himself to the possibility that his daughter might never speak again. This resignation did not soften him, it made him colder. He began to withdraw from her in the way that men like Sangwoo Park withdraw from things they cannot control. He spent more time at his offices, more time with his organization, more time building his empire higher and wider, as if the accumulation of power could somehow compensate for the loss of his daughter's voice. He remarried quickly, a woman named Jin-hye who was beautiful and complicit and asked no difficult questions. Jin-hye attempted to be a mother to Minna in the way that a person might attempt to assemble furniture from IKEA without reading the instructions. Well-intentioned but fundamentally confused about how things were supposed to fit together. Then one autumn evening when the rain was falling like whispered secrets and Seoul was gray and beautiful and sad, everything changed. It happened at Celestial, the most expensive restaurant in the Gangnam district. A place that served food so artfully arranged it seemed almost criminal to eat it. Sangwoo had taken Minna and Jin-hye there for dinner, a rare family outing that was more about maintaining appearances than about any genuine desire for familial bonding. Minna sat between them at a table that overlooked the city, watching the lights of Seoul blur and separate and blur again through the rain-streaked windows, thinking about nothing in particular, existing in the way that silent people exist, fully present but somehow removed, observing rather than participating. The waiter who brought the scallop ceviche was a woman with skin the color of rich mahogany, with hair braided in intricate patterns, with eyes that held a particular kind of sadness that Minna recognized immediately. She was in her late 40s, moving with the fluid grace of someone who had learned long ago how to occupy space without drawing too much attention to herself, how to be present without being visible. She was the kind of person that wealthy people looked through rather than at, the kind of person whose face they would forget the moment they turned away. But Minna saw her. More than that, she recognized her. She knew this woman. Not from her current life, not from the past 2 years of silence, but from somewhere deeper, from memory that predated language itself. She knew the shape of her hands. She knew the specific way she moved. She knew the scent of her, something like vanilla and something like hospital antiseptic and something like safety, the way that certain smells can unlock entire rooms of childhood that had been locked away, forgotten, deemed unimportant by the machinery of growing up and moving forward and learning not to ask difficult questions. Minna's hand lifted slowly as if moving of its own volition. Her small finger extended, pointing directly at the woman, at the waiter who was not really a waiter, at the ghost who was not supposed to be real. And from her throat, from the deepest part of her, from the place where 2 years of silence had accumulated like water behind a dam, came a single word, a word that broke through everything, that shattered the careful silence she had constructed, that announced itself to the entire restaurant with the force of something that had been building pressure for months and months and months. Mama. The word did not come out small or weak. It came out as a shout, as a declaration, as a reversal of everything she had been since the morning of her mother's funeral. It came out with so much force that several nearby diners turned to look. A wine glass rattled on a nearby table. The woman froze, the plate of scallop ceviche suspended in her hands, her body going very still in a way that suggested she had just received an electric shock. Her face went white beneath her dark skin, a white that spread across her cheeks like spilled milk, like paint, like the erasure of something that had existed for a very long time. Sangwoo turned to look at his daughter with an expression of shock that quickly calcified into something harder, something colder. His hand reached out to grab her wrist, to pull her back into silence, but he stopped when he saw where her finger was pointing. He looked at the waiter. The waiter looked back at him. And in that moment, suspended in the rain-gray light of the restaurant, the entire architecture of carefully constructed lies came crashing down like a building after an earthquake. Because the woman standing in front of them was Amelia Washington, and Amelia Washington was supposed to be dead. Amelia had been brought into the Park family's life 7 years ago, before Minna was born, as a surrogate mother. Sangwoo and Jin-hye had been unable to have children, and Sangwoo's father, had demanded an heir. The arrangement had been made quietly, The way that such things are made in circles where money can purchase almost anything, where the body of a poor American woman could be rented for the specific purpose of carrying another man's child. Amelia had been paid $50,000, had signed documents that supposedly relinquished all rights to the child she would carry, had been treated with the careful distance that one uses when dealing with something one owns but does not wish to touch. But something had gone wrong. Or perhaps something had gone right, depending on one's perspective. Somewhere in the 40 weeks of pregnancy, Amelia had stopped being a surrogate and had become a mother. She had carried Minna not as a business transaction but as a person, had felt the kicks and the movements and the particular kind of love that pregnancy generates regardless of the legal documentation that suggests otherwise. After Minna was born, she had held the child, had sung to her, had nursed her for the first 6 months before being replaced with formula and a nanny and the systematic removal of her from the child's life. Except that she had not stayed removed. She had come back to Seoul from Detroit, had taken work as a live-in nanny for the Park family, had spent the next 3 years in the mansion holding Minna, reading to her, braiding her hair, teaching her the kinds of things that mothers teach daughters. Not through words but through presence, through the simple fact of being there, of being the first face the child saw in the morning and often the last face she saw before sleep. She had loved Minna with the kind of love that cannot be undone by contracts or distance or the passage of time. And then she had disappeared. One day she was there and the next day she was gone, and the official story was that she had died in a car accident in Busan, that the body had been so badly damaged they'd had to rely on dental records for identification, that the family should remember her kindly but understand that such things happened, that it was tragic but it was also final. Minna, who was only 6 years old at the time, had not understood death yet. She had only understood absence. She had only understood that the woman she loved most had vanished from her life, and that nothing anyone could say would explain where she had gone or why she had stopped coming back. What had actually happened was more complicated and more terrible and more miraculous than any of the official stories suggested. Amelia had discovered that Sang-woo was involved in something dark, something that went beyond the mere accumulation of wealth and power that she had assumed was the nature of his business. She had overheard conversations about trafficking, about the movement of women from poor countries into forced labor, about networks that stretched across continents. She had seen photographs that she was not meant to see. She had understood, with the clarity that sometimes comes to people who are observant and intelligent and have experienced poverty, that she was living in a house with a man who did terrible things, who profited from the suffering of people like her, who had perhaps even profited from her own desperation. And she had tried to leave. She had planned it carefully, saved money, researched immigration attorneys, attempted to build a case for custody of Minna, the child she loved more than she loved her own life. But Sang-woo had discovered her plans. And rather than simply fire her or pay her off as a less careful criminal might have done, he had arranged for her to disappear. She had been taken to a facility in the countryside, had been told that she would be held there indefinitely, that any attempt to contact authorities would result in harm coming to her daughter, that resistance was pointless. She had spent 6 years in that facility. 6 years of believing that Minna had grown up without her, that the child who had loved her had learned to forget her, that she had been excised from history like a photograph being cut out of a family album. 6 years of despair so profound that there were days when she did not want to wake up, when she lay on her narrow bed and thought about the probability of escape and the certainty of failure and wondered if it would not be better to simply give up entirely. But then, 3 months ago, the facility had been raided. A federal investigation into human trafficking had uncovered the network of safe houses and detention facilities that Sang-woo Park maintained for the women he imported and the people who might become inconvenient obstacles to his business. Amelia had been freed along with 19 other women, had been given temporary residency status, had been processed through the system with the kind of gentle care that sometimes emerges when government agencies confront the reality of human suffering. She had been terrified to come back to Seoul. The therapist assigned to her by the Federal Victim Services Program had suggested that she should relocate to America, that she should build a new life far from the man who had imprisoned her, far from the country that held so many painful memories. But Amelia could not leave. Because Minna was here. Minna was somewhere in this city, and even though it had been 6 years, even though the child had likely forgotten her entirely, even though it was probably dangerous and certainly unwise, Amelia could not accept the idea of living her life on a different continent from the child she loved. She had taken work in a restaurant, had chosen one where she knew wealthy people came, had nourished a small hope that somehow in the vastness of Seoul, she might catch a glimpse of her daughter. She had not expected to find her so directly. She had not expected Minna to know her. She had certainly not expected the child's first word in 2 years to be addressed to her, to name her as mother in front of her father and his new wife, to shatter the careful architecture of secrecy that had kept them apart. What happened next occurred with the particular intensity that such moments possess. Sangwoo rose from the table with a slowness that suggested he was operating from a script he had prepared long ago, had prepared for the possibility that Amelia might resurface, that she might become a problem that required solving. He was a man who believed in control, in the elimination of variables, in the permanent solution of complications. But before he could move toward Amelia, before he could gesture to one of the men who were positioned throughout the restaurant maintaining security, before he could do anything at all, his daughter did something unexpected. Minna stood up. She had not stood up suddenly or without control. She had stood with the deliberate slowness of someone who had made a decision and was committed to seeing it through. She was small, barely reaching her father's waist, but she stepped away from him and walked toward Amelia with the certainty of a person walking toward something that was true, something that was real, something that mattered more than fear or obedience or the complicated rules that governed their family. The other diners had begun to notice that something was happening. The restaurant had developed that particular quality of stillness that precedes something significant, the way that a forest goes quiet before a storm. Conversations trailed off. Forks paused halfway to mouths. The entire establishment seemed to be holding its breath. Minna reached Amelia and took the woman's hand. This was significant. This was a statement. This was a child saying, in a gesture that was more powerful than any words could be, "I know you. I remember you. I choose you." Amelia's hand trembled. The plate of scallop ceviche fell from her other hand and shattered against the floor with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the silence of the restaurant. She looked down at Minna, at this child who was now 9 years old and who barely looked like the 6-year-old she had left behind, but whose eyes held the same essential quality, the same direct gaze, the same unexpected wisdom. "Minna," she whispered, and her voice cracked on the child's name like it was breaking glass. Minna squeezed her hand tighter and spoke again. The second word was more difficult than the first, as if the machinery of speech had to warm up, had to remember how to function after such a long period of disuse. "Don't go," she said. "Please." Those 3 words, "I don't go," had taken 6 months of therapy to access, had required a level of courage that most adults would have found difficult to muster. But for Minna they had been simple. They were the most important words she had ever spoken. They were worth the 2 years of silence that had preceded them. They were worth everything. What happened in the moments after that was complicated and occurred with a strange simultaneity that made it difficult to understand the sequence of events. Sangwoo, recovering from his initial shock, began to move toward his daughter with clear intention. The security personnel positioned throughout the restaurant moved as well, but not toward Minna. They moved toward the exits, toward the back of the establishment, toward Amelia, because Sangwoo's first impulse was always to protect what was his, and he was not willing to accept that his daughter might have made a choice that diverged from his own wishes. But the staff of Celestial Restaurant had also noticed what was happening. More specifically, the manager, a woman named Yun-hee who had trained under head chefs across Europe and Asia and who understood the particular vulnerability of servers and kitchen staff because her own sister had gone missing 3 years ago under circumstances that remained unexplained, moved to shield Amelia and Minna. She positioned herself between them and Sangwoo's approaching figure with the kind of courage that comes from having nothing left to lose. And then Jin-hee did something unexpected. She stood as well, but instead of moving toward her husband, she moved toward Amelia. Her face showed the strain of someone making a decision that would cost them everything, but she had recognized something in the exchange between Minna and Amelia, had recognized it because she was a woman who had never been allowed to make her own choices, who had been brought into a marriage as an accessory and a child-bearer, who had spent 6 years in proximity to Minna's silence and had come to understand that it was a form of resistance. "Stop," Jin-hee said to her husband. Her voice was quiet. "Please stop." For a moment the world seemed to hang in suspension. A man like Sangwoo Park did not accept contradiction from women. He did not accept limits on his power. He did not accept the possibility that the carefully constructed world he had built might come apart at the seams because of something as small and inconsequential as a child's love for the woman who had given birth to her. But Minna's second word had broken something. Her choice had made something manifest. The silence she had chosen to break had chosen which side of herself she wanted to be. And in that instant Sang-woo understood, with the clarity of a man watching something he had built crumble, that he could not hold this. He could not force this. He could not control this because it had nothing to do with power and everything to do with love. And love was the one thing that had always been beyond his reach, the one thing that his money and his violence and his elaborate organization could never purchase or command. The Seoul police arrived at Celestial 17 minutes after the first call was placed to emergency services. They arrived not because someone had called about a potential crime in progress, but because someone had called to report a missing child. And when the officers arrived and began asking questions, the story that emerged was complicated and required the involvement of federal authorities, which meant that it was reported up the chain of command with the urgency that such things deserve. What followed was an investigation that would eventually uncover the network of facilities that Sang-woo had maintained, would corroborate Amelia's testimony about her imprisonment, would connect the dots of a criminal enterprise that went deeper and more widely than the federal authorities had previously understood. But those details emerged later, in courtrooms and federal buildings and rooms where men in suits discussed the mechanisms of justice and punishment. What happened immediately was that Amelia and Min-ah were separated, which caused Min-ah to speak a third word in succession, a word that surprised everyone including herself. She said her father's name. Not as a child addresses a parent, but as a statement of fact, as an identification of a person she was beginning to understand she might need to protect herself against. And in that name, spoken for the first time in 2 years, she was drawing a boundary, claiming her agency, demonstrating that her silence had not been a weakness but a kind of gathering, a preparation for a moment that would require her to break through everything that had been built in her life and choose differently. The authorities took statements from everyone present. Sang-woo, with the resources of a man accustomed to legal representation, hired a team of attorneys and maintained silence otherwise. Jin-hae spoke to the police officers and to the federal agents and told them everything, not out of loyalty to her husband but out of relief, the relief of someone who had been holding secrets for so long that confession felt like exhaling after holding one's breath underwater. The restaurant staff corroborated the facts. The security personnel, when questioned separately and carefully, revealed more than Sang-woo would have preferred. Amelia was treated as a victim and a witness. She was given temporary housing, was connected with victim services, was assigned a federal agent whose job was to ensure her safety and to preserve her testimony for the legal proceedings that would inevitably follow. She asked to see Min-ah, and after 2 days of bureaucratic processing, this was arranged under the supervision of a court-appointed family service worker. The reunion took place in a small beige-colored room that smelled like floor cleaner and fluorescent lights and the particular staleness of institutional spaces. Min-ah sat at a small table with a juice box and a plate of cookies that she did not touch. When Amelia entered the room, the child stood without being asked to stand and walked into the woman's arms with the certainty of someone returning home after a long journey. "I remembered," Min-ah said. It was a complete sentence. It was the first complete sentence she had spoken in 2 years and 3 months. "I remembered you the whole time." Amelia held her daughter, and she was her daughter regardless of what any contract or legal document might say, and wept with a quality of crying that suggested she was releasing 2 years' worth of grief and despair and the particular kind of suffering that comes from separation from someone you love. "I'm so sorry," Amelia whispered into Min-ah's hair. "I'm so sorry I left you." "You didn't leave me," Min-ah said. She pulled back enough to look at her mother's face. "I was waiting. I knew you would come back." The session lasted 2 hours. During that time, Min-ah spoke in complete sentences about small things and large things. She told Amelia about school, about her therapist, about the years of silence and why she had chosen to stay silent and what it had felt like to break through it. She did not ask why Amelia had disappeared, as if some part of her had always known that the story was more complicated than the official explanation, that her mother's absence had not been a choice but something that had been done to her, something that had been forced. In the days that followed, the case began to move through the systems with the particular momentum that cases involving federal crimes and child welfare violations acquire. Sang-woo Park was arrested formally and charged with human trafficking, money laundering, organized crime, and a range of other charges that reflected the scope of his operation. The facility in the countryside where Amelia had been held was raided again, this time with the full knowledge of the federal authorities, and 32 women were found and freed, women ranging in age from 18 to 53, women from 9 different countries, women whose stories reflected the particular vulnerabilities that poverty and desperation can create. The case became public. The media, smelling the particular flavor of scandal that comes with a rich and powerful man being brought down, descended on the story with the intensity of a flock of birds descending on a field of grain. Headlines appeared about the silent princess, about the waiter who was not a waiter, about the criminal enterprise that the respectable businessman had been running, about the family that had been shattered by the revelation of truth. Jean Hay, attempting to protect herself legally, filed for divorce and agreed to cooperate fully with the federal investigation. She was eventually not charged with any crime, though she lived with the understanding that she had been complicit in systems of exploitation through her inaction and her silence. She attempted to maintain visitation rights with Minna, but the child was clear about her feelings on the matter. She did not wish to see Jean Hay. She did not wish to maintain any connection to that part of her life. And the courts, taking the child's wishes into account, agreed. The question of Minna's custody became the focus of a separate proceeding. Normally, the child would have been placed in foster care, would have entered the system, would have become another case file in the machinery of the state's child welfare apparatus. But Amelia, with the support of a victim advocacy organization and an attorney who believed strongly in the particular justice of allowing a mother and daughter to be reunited, filed for custody. The proceedings were contentious. Sangwoo's attorneys attempted to argue that Amelia had no legal claim to the child, that the surrogacy agreement had explicitly relinquished all maternal rights, that her imprisonment had been a separate legal matter that had nothing to do with custody. But the judge, a woman named Park Hae-young who had spent 30 years on the bench and who had developed a sophisticated understanding of the difference between what the law said and what justice required, ruled in Amelia's favor. She awarded full custody to Amelia Washington, and in her ruling she made several statements about the nature of motherhood that would be quoted in legal journals and discussed in law schools for years afterward. She said that the law could attempt to regulate biology and emotion, but it could not deny the fact that a person who had carried a child, who had loved a child, who had been separated from a child through violence and imprisonment, had claims that transcended legal documents. She said that Minna herself had made clear who she believed her mother to be. She said that the role of the courts was to honor that truth, not to obscure it. The custody was awarded. Amelia and Minna were officially recognized as mother and daughter. And in the moment after the judge's gavel came down, Minna reached over and squeezed her mother's hand and spoke clearly in the courtroom, where everyone present could hear her. "I love you," she said. "I've always loved you." The trial of Sangwoo Park lasted 14 months. Amelia testified multiple times, describing her imprisonment, her fear, her desperation, her love for her daughter. The federal investigators presented evidence of the network of facilities, of the documentation of the trafficking operations, of the financial records that proved the scope of his criminal enterprise. Dozens of other women testified about their experiences, about the conditions they had been held in, about the threats and violence they had experienced. Sangwoo maintained his innocence throughout, maintained that he had been misunderstood, that the facility in the countryside was a rehabilitation center for troubled women, that any imprisonment had been consensual or had been the result of misunderstanding. His attorneys attempted to undermine Amelia's testimony by suggesting that her version of events had been influenced by her emotional investment in the case, that her memory might be unreliable, that she might be exaggerating or outright fabricating details for the purposes of gaining custody of Minna. But the evidence was overwhelming. And more than that, there were other women. 19 other women who corroborated Amelia's story, who described their own imprisonments, who testified about the methods used to control them, who provided details that could be verified through other channels. The jury, composed of 10 women and 2 men, took 6 days to reach a verdict. When they returned, it was unanimous: guilty on all counts. Sangwoo Park was sentenced to 67 years in federal prison, a sentence that, given his age, amounted to a life sentence. In the months following the trial, Amelia and Minna began the difficult process of learning how to be a family without the shadow of trauma and separation hanging over them. This was not a process that could be rushed. It required patience and therapy and the slow accumulation of small moments of safety and stability. They moved to a small apartment in a neighborhood far from Hanamdong, far from the world of wealth and power that had been Minna's birthright. Amelia worked at a community center teaching English to immigrants, A job that felt meaningful in a way that waiting tables never could. Minna attended school, was evaluated for her educational level, and found to be exceptionally intelligent despite, or perhaps because of, the 2 years of silence. Her teachers noted that she was thoughtful and observant, that she seemed to understand nuances and subtleties that other 9-year-olds missed. The silence when it came now was different. It was no longer a fortress. It was simply Minna's natural way of being. She spoke when she felt she had something important to say, and she was quiet when quietness felt appropriate. She had reclaimed her voice, but she had also learned that not all words deserved to be spoken, that there was value in observation, that understanding the world deeply was sometimes more important than filling it with noise. 2 years after the trial ended, after Sang-woo Park had spent 2 years in prison and had begun serving the long stretch of his sentence that stretched before him into an indefinite future, Amelia and Minna were sitting in their small apartment, and Minna asked her mother a question. "Do you wish I was someone else's daughter?" she asked. It was a strange question, the kind that a child who had been separated from a biological parent might ask, the kind that suggests an understanding of complex emotions and competing claims and the possibility that love might be divided or conditional. Amelia, who had spent the past 2 years learning how to be the mother she had always wanted to be, did not hesitate in her answer. "No," she said. "You are exactly who I would choose to have as my daughter if I were given the choice at the beginning of the world. I would choose you every single time." Minna, now 11 years old, leaned against her mother on the couch where they were sitting, and they sat together in a silence that was comfortable and complete. Outside, Seoul continued its particular kind of humming existence, millions of people moving through their lives, conducting their business, unaware of the small miracle that had occurred in their city, unaware of the child who had broken through silence to save her own mother, who had demonstrated a capacity for love and recognition that transcended all the complicated systems and laws and structures that human beings had constructed. The media had moved on to other stories. The federal government had moved on to other cases. Sang-woo Park remained in his cell, aging into his elder years in a prison facility where he would eventually die, his empire dismantled, his power rendered meaningless by concrete walls and bars and time. But in a small apartment in a neighborhood that most wealthy people would never visit, a mother and daughter who had been separated by violence and force and the particular cruelty that systems of exploitation can create were learning how to be together. They were learning how to heal. They were demonstrating, through their simple existence and their daily choices and their absolute commitment to each other, something true about human nature, something that governments and criminals and all the powerful systems in the world could not ultimately control or destroy. Minna would carry the silence with her for the rest of her life. Not the silence that trauma creates, but the silence that understanding creates. The silence of a person who has learned that words are powerful and should be used carefully. The silence of a person who has experienced depth and darkness and has emerged into light with her capacity for love intact. And Amelia would carry the knowledge of what she had lost and what she had recovered, would carry the particular kind of strength that comes from having been broken and having refused to stay broken, would carry forward the understanding that love is not always recognized immediately but that sometimes it waits, patient and eternal, until the moment when it can finally be acknowledged and claimed. In the years that followed, Minna would grow into a young woman who was quiet and thoughtful and deeply engaged with the world. She would become interested in criminal justice, would spend her teenage years reading about systems of exploitation and the mechanisms through which vulnerable people are victimized. She would consider, at various points in her adolescence, whether she wanted to pursue law or social work or some combination of the two, some way of using what had happened to her to prevent the same things from happening to other people. And Amelia would watch her daughter grow and would marvel at the resilience and strength that had always been there, hidden beneath the silence, waiting for the moment when it could finally emerge and be seen and be honored by the world. This is the story of a child who did not speak for 2 years, and of a mother who was taken from her. It is the story of a broken family that was repaired through love and the refusal to accept lies and the particular kind of courage that it takes to claim something as yours when the world has told you that you have no claim to it. It is the story of silence breaking into speech, of the power that comes from reclaiming your voice, of the way that a single word, mama, can reshape an entire world and make everything that came before suddenly make sense. And it is a story about Seoul, about a city where wealth and power can hide terrible things, where criminals can build empires and exploit the vulnerable, but where love, in its purest form, is sometimes more powerful than any system of control. It is a reminder that the people we dismiss as invisible, the waiters, the nannies, the staff members who move through the spaces of the wealthy without being truly seen, are not actually invisible at all. They are witnesses. They are survivors. They are people with their own stories, their own capacity for love, their own claims on the world that we ignore at our peril. If you were Min-Ah in that moment when you recognized your mother, would you have had the courage to speak? Would you have risked everything by reaching across 2 years of silence to claim something that no one had told you was yours to claim? What would you have done if you were Amelia, imprisoned for years, believing your daughter had forgotten you, given the chance to be seen and recognized despite all the systems that wanted to keep you invisible? These are the questions that resonate at the heart of this story, the questions that matter because they ask us to consider what we would do in the face of truth, what choices we would make when confronted with the possibility of love. They ask us to think about the power of voices, about the importance of being heard, about the way that one moment of honesty can shatter everything that came before and build something entirely new. Tell us in the comments, what country are you watching from right now? How many of you have experienced separation from someone you love and have gotten a second chance? What would your first word be if you were breaking silence to save someone you loved? We're aiming for 15,000 likes on this video. Let's reach it together. Subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next story. Because next time, we're diving into what happened when Sangwoo's organization tried to take revenge on Amelia from inside prison, and how Min-Ah became the strategic mind that her father never wanted her to become. We'll explore how a child of silence learned to speak the language of justice, how she became an advocate for the other women who had been held in her father's facilities, and how she transformed her trauma into something that protected others from experiencing the same pain. The Silent Princess's journey does not end with one word. It begins with one word, and everything that follows is her learning to use her voice to reshape the world. Thank you for watching. Thank you for being part of this story. And remember, the voices that seem small, that have been silenced, that have been made invisible, they are often the most powerful of all.